what gets remembered in history, and what gets left behind. If you open a textbook, you'd think the biggest events, the most important ones, are the ones we remember. But that's not how history works. Historian David Blight, writing about memory after the Civil War, argues that history is not just about facts. It's about which stories a society chooses to elevate and which it chooses to silence. And sometimes, silence isn't accidental. Sometimes it's convenient. Today on a special edition of the JQA Treatment, we're exploring tragedies that were just as devastating, sometimes more so than the events we remember, but were pushed to the margins of American memory. Instead of looking at some of the cabinet members, some of the influential people in the background of presidents, we start looking at some of the tragedies, some of the other bigger events that were overshadowed by other events in history. We're going to look at 5 different events today, and I wanted to do this as a special edition, mostly because I wanted to kind of shake things up a little bit from the norm of the JQA treatment and throw something different at you. So thank you to all those who've been listening so far to the JQA treatment. I really appreciate your support. And here we go with the new special edition of the JQA treatment. So first up is April 27th, 1865. The Sultana Explosion, a catastrophic steamboat disaster that occurred on the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee. The sidewheel steamboat, Sultana, dangerously overloaded with recently released Union prisoners of war, exploded after a boiler failure, killing roughly 1,700 people, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. So let's give you a little bit of background. It was built in 1863 in Cincinnati. It is a 260-footer designed to carry about 376 passengers and crew. In April of 1865, Captain J. Cass Mason contracted with Union officials at Vicksburg to transport paroled prisoners north, allegedly secured through a bribery deal with Quartermaster Reuben Hatch. The government paid per man transported, incentivizing overcrowding. When the ship left Vicksburg, it carried over 2,100 soldiers and civilians, 6 times its rated capacity, along with cargo and crew. So around 2 a.m., on April 27th, 3 of Sultana's 4 interconnected boilers exploded, tearing the vessel apart. The blast hurled hundreds into the flooded Mississippi. Fire quickly consumed the wooded superstructure. The nearby steamer, Bostonian No. 2, rescued survivors as they floated downstream toward Memphis. But many died from burns, drowning, or even hypothermia. Only about 700 people survived the catastrophe. So within hours, an estimated 1,800 people are dying. Now, historian Jerry O'Potter, who wrote extensively on the disaster, he argues that this wasn't just an accident. It was a product of wartime corruption and bureaucratic indifference. Government officials were paid per soldier, like I just mentioned, and so they were overcrowding the ship. But investigations blamed insufficient water levels and flawed boiler repair rather than sabotage. The overloaded decks caused water to surge unevenly inside the boilers, exposing red-hot metal and triggering explosive steam pressure. No one was ever held criminally responsible, of course, and the disaster overshadowed by the end of the Civil War and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln days earlier, so it received little national attention. Now, the tragedy did spur stricter steamboat inspection and boiler safety standards, and it led to the creation of the Steamboat Inspection Service and companies like the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company memorials. And the Sultana Association now preserve the memory of those lost. So the wreck lies buried under farmland near Marion, Arkansas. So it's interesting that, days earlier, assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it occurs, but you have this huge explosion where 1,800 people are dying, but one man dies, and that's the talk of the town. Now, granted, this is one man that's the president of the United States, but, historian Drew Gilpin Faust reminds us that the end of the Civil War was already a moment saturated with death. There's over 600,000 dead after the Civil War, so in that context, even a tragedy of 1,800 lives could definitely disappear. Crazy, right? Let's move into a different topic now. And this is in a little bit ahead of time, in 1937 in Texas, with the New London school explosion, killing nearly 300 students and teachers. It's immediate, it's violent, and it's devastating. But I guess the issue is, there's no villain. Historian Edward Linenthal, who studies how Americans remember tragedy, argues that memory often depends on moral clarity, a clear sense of who's responsible. The explosion was a natural gas explosion that destroyed this school in New London, Texas on March 18th, 1937. It remains the deadliest school disaster in U.S. history, killing nearly 300 students and teachers and prompting sweeping safety reforms in gas regulation and public building codes. It happened about 3:17 p.m. during the last class period of the day. A shop teacher switched on an electric sander, igniting an accumulation of odorless wet gas that had leaked beneath the building from an unauthorized tap into a residue gas line serving nearby oil fields. The resulting blast lifted the steel frame structure into the air and collapsed its walls and roof. The explosion could be heard 4 miles away, leveling what had been one of the nation's wealthiest rural schools. Parents, oilfield workers, and rescuers labored through rain and darkness, recovering victims and survivors within 17 hours. Now, investigators from the state of Texas and the U.S. Bureau of Mines determined that unodorized gas from a cost-saving, unauthorized connection caused the disaster. Although no officials were found criminally liable, public outrage followed, and lawsuits were filed by victims' families. Governor James V. Allred declared martial law at the site to coordinate rescue and recovery operations. So again, the tragedy spurred Texas to enact the first law mandating the malodorants, such as mercaptan, but be added to a natural gas to aid in leak detection, and a standard that quickly became nationwide. But the disaster also prompted stricter construction and inspection codes for public buildings. A new school was built on the same site, and in 1939 a granite cenotaph memorial was dedicated nearby. And so the survivors' reunions and historical exhibits continue to underscore the enduring impact of the event on community safety culture and the regulation of natural gas systems in the United States. But going back to the idea that the idea of no clear sense of who is responsible, you can, especially when there's children involved and there's this massive amount of families coming out and having these questions of why, and having these questions of, needing to have these answers. There's no shooter, there's no enemy, there's no intentional act, so it doesn't fit the narrative frameworks we use to process tragedy. And so without a narrative, it kind of fades. And even though its impact was massive, it led to nationwide regulations requiring odorants and natural gas. We still don't remember its story because it's something that just kind of fades away into obscurity, even though it was one of the largest school disasters in U.S. history. Going into a different tragedy, we look at the SS Eastland disaster, a maritime tragedy that happened on July 24th, 1915, when the passenger steamer Eastland rolled onto its side in the Chicago River. Bound for a company picnic, the ship capsized at the dock, killing 844 people, making it one of the deadliest accidents in U.S. maritime and Chicago history. Now, some background is that the Eastland, it was built in 1903, so it was built 12 years before this, and it was nicknamed the Speed Queen of the Great Lakes, and it was long known for instability. It was chartered by the Western Electric Company to carry employees and their families across Lake Michigan to a picnic in Michigan City, Indiana. Now, shortly after boarding began, the ship began to list even before leaving the dock. At about 7:30 a.m., moments after its mooring lines were released, the Eastland rolled onto its port side in 20 feet of water, trapping hundreds inside. Many victims drowned or were crushed within sight of the riverbank, while onlookers, police, and fire crews tried desperately to rescue survivors. Now, subsequent inquiries cited multiple contributing factors. design instability from years of structural modifications, overcrowding, and the added weight of lifeboats mandated after the Titanic disaster. Now, federal courts ultimately found no criminal negligence. The ship's owners were not held liable because it had passed official inspections. The wreck was raised in August 1915 and converted to the U.S. Navy training vessel USS Wilmot, serving through World War II before being scrapped in 1946. And the disaster devastated many immigrant families, particularly Czech Americans from Chicago's West Side, and prompted calls for stricter passenger vessel stability standards. So today, there's memorial plaques and annual commemorations near the LaSalle Street Bridge, honor those who lost their lives. And historian Timothy Guilfoyle points out that many of the victims were immigrant workers, Czech, Polish, and other Eastern European communities. So this matters, because historian Howard Zinn argued that American history often centers the powerful while marginalizing the working class. Now compare this to the RMS Titanic sinking. There's a lot of wealthy passengers, there's a dramatic voyage, there's a clear storyline, but the Eastland, working class people on a company picnic, no mythology, no enduring narrative, no I'll never let go, Jack, nothing. It's not the ocean, it's not during a storm, there's no iceberg, it's just a river. And because it happened to have immigrant workers, predominantly immigrant workers on there, it's kind of left in obscurity. And it's around the same, it's still in 1915, it's a couple months after, or it's in recent memory of the Titanic. And so when we look at this, it's like memory isn't neutral. It kind of reflects who lives society values enough to remember. Like who is able to, what is valued, when you're looking at this kind of stuff. One that I remember, that I wanted to bring up, that I remember reading about in grad school was, now this is going back again, this is moving from like the accidental forgetting to maybe intentional silence, but this is one I remember reading, in fact I still have a book on it, was the Colfax Massacre. And this is a racially motivated mass killing that took place on April 13th, 1873 in Colfax, Louisiana during the Reconstruction era. It's regarded as the deadliest episode of racial violence in that period and a turning point that undermined federal protection of black civil rights in the post-Civil War South. Now, following the U.S. Civil War, newly freed African Americans in Louisiana gained voting rights in political offices under Reconstruction policies, and it was backed by Republican Governor William Pitt Kellogg. And so after the disputed 1872 election, both Republican and Democratic claimants organized rival governments. In Grant Parish, black militia that was loyal to the Republicans occupied the courthouse to prevent a Democratic takeover, while white paramilitaries, including members of the KKK and the White League, mobilized to drive them out. So on Easter Sunday in 1873, a white force of about 300 men surrounded the courthouse. After exchanging gunfire and firing a cannon, they set the building ablaze. And when the black defenders fled or surrendered, the attackers shot, hanged, or burned many to death. Contemporary estimates range from 60 to 150 African Americans killed, nearly all after they had ceased resisting. Only 3 white men died. Federal troops restored order the next day. Now, federal prosecutions indicted nearly 100 attackers under the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 71, but only 3 were convicted, and their convictions were overturned in United States v. Cruikshank. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied only to state actions, not individuals, sharply weakening federal authority to protect black citizens from racial violence. The decision encouraged white supremacist militias and helped pave the way for the Jim Crow era. So for decades, the event was mischaracterized locally as the Colfax Riot, and monuments honored the white perpetrators. Now, these markers were removed in 2021 and replaced in 2023 by the Colfax Massacre Memorial, a granite monument listing identified black victims and acknowledging the massacre's true history. Now, historian Eric Foner argues that Reconstruction was one of the most misunderstood and deliberately distorted periods in American history. And this is why, because for decades, textbooks minimized or ignored events like Colfax, mostly because it's acknowledging them it would challenge the narrative that Reconstruction governments were corrupt failures. Now, rather than experiments in interracial democracy violently overthrown. So it's not like it was forgotten, it was somewhat suppressed. And sometimes history isn't lost, it's just kind of pushed out of view. Now, more so now in the last 10 years or so, it feels like there's been, last 10, maybe even 20 years, there's been a lot more push to incorporate a lot more of these episodes in order to truly understand the gravity of the situation in Reconstruction and how much deterioration the government had within Reconstruction. So the last big segment that we're going to go over is one that happens fast forwarding into 1918 in Minnesota, the Cloquet Fire. And the Cloquet Fire was a catastrophic series of wildfires that swept through northeastern Minnesota on October 12, 1918. And it was centered around Cloquet, Moose Lake, and Duluth. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in the state's history, killing more than 450 people and devastating entire communities. Now, the fire arose after months of extreme drought combined with unsafe logging practices that left forests littered with dry slash. Sparks from locomotives near Brookston and Tamarack ignited multiple small fires. When a cold front brought 60 to 75 mile per hour winds and plunging humidity on October 12th, these fires merged into a firestorm that raced across northeastern Minnesota, consuming forests, farms, and towns in a matter of hours. Now, separate fire fronts moved toward both Cloquet and Duluth, while others swept southeast through Moose Lake and Kettle River. Entire towns such as Brookston and Automba were destroyed, and residents sought refuge in lakes and rivers. In Cloquet, factory whistles and evacuation trains saved thousands, though most of the city's buildings were lost. The blaze burned out by early morning on October 13th after scorching roughly 1,500 square miles. The disaster left an estimated 52,000 people homeless or injured. The American Red Cross, Minnesota Home Guard, and National Guard organized extensive relief and rebuilding efforts. Federal and state commissions later supervised compensation claims, and railroad companies were eventually held liable for damages. Rebuilding lasted several years, and the event prompted new fire prevention laws and forestry reforms. The fire reshaped Minnesota's approach to forestry and emergency management. It is commemorated through memorials, historical exhibits, and continuing wildfire education efforts by institutions such as the Carleton County Historical Society and the Minnesota Historical Society. So the legacy really underscores the importance of land use practices, disaster preparedness, and community resilience in the face of natural disaster. You know, this is happening in 1918. What else is happening in 1918? The world's dealing with World War I, the Spanish flu, and historian John Barry, in his work on the flu pandemic, notes that Americans often suppress discussion of overwhelming tragedies simply just to cope. So when death is everywhere, specific tragedies blur together. And memory has limits. You know, when those limits are exceeded, events disappear into the background. I guess I'll talk about one more. There's one that's in 1907, the Monongah, I never know if I'm saying it right, the Monongah Mining Disaster, where there's over 350 miners that die. And this happens December 6, 1907 in Monongah. I'm going to say Monongah. That sounds better. Monongah, West Virginia. But if you're listening out there and you know the true thing, please let me know. The blast at the Fairmont Coal Company's mines number 6 and 8 killed at least 361 miners, likely many more, making it the deadliest mining disaster in U.S. history. It triggered nationwide reforms in industrial safety and helped launch federal mine regulation. Shortly after 10 a.m., 2 linked mines erupted and a violent chain explosion felt miles away. The blast destroyed mine entrances and ventilation systems, releasing suffocating gases. Contemporary reports suggest ignition of methane gas and coal dust, possibly triggered by a spark from machinery or a mine car collision. The true death toll was higher than recorded, since miners' logs were destroyed and workers often brought sons or relatives underground. Now, the majority of the victims were, get this, recent immigrants, like Italians, Hungarians, Poles, or Russians. reflecting West Virginia's rapidly expanding early 20th century coal industry. Many families lost fathers and sons in a single morning. More than 170 Italians died, and the disaster left roughly 250 widows and 1,000 orphans. Relief efforts raised about $150,000 nationwide to support survivors. Now, with no organized rescue teams, volunteers from neighboring states descended into the mines under deadly conditions. Their recovery of hundreds of bodies, some of boys as young as 8, shocked the nation. Public outrage spurred President Teddy Roosevelt's call for federal oversight. By 1910, the U.S. Bureau of Mines was established to study and prevent such accidents, laying the groundwork for modern mine safety laws. Now, Monongah remains a touchstone in American labor and immigrant history. A marble statue called the Heroine of Monongah and the Italian-made memorial bell near Town Hall honor the victims. In 2009, Congress designated December 6 as National Miners' Day, ensuring that there was continued remembrance of the tragedy that reshaped workplace safety in the United States. Now, historian David Rodinger emphasizes how labor history in the United States is often fragmented, especially when it involves immigrant workers. If people aren't fully counted in life, they often aren't fully remembered in death. Erasure can begin with something as simple and as devastating as a missing name. So what ties all of this together? Let's go back to the historians. David Blight tells us memory is selective. Eric Foner tells us it can be shaped by power. Zinn reminds us it often excludes the marginalized, and put that together and you get this. History is not just what happens or what happened, it's what survives. And survival depends on timing, narrative, power, and usefulness. So I guess the question I want to leave you with is, if these events were just as deadly, just as significant, what else are we forgetting right now? Because somewhere in the present, there are events unfolding that will either become history or disappear from it. And we won't know which ones until it's already decided. Thank you for sticking around for this episode of the JQA Treatment, this special episode of the JQA Treatment. Stay tuned for more specials that come in throughout, and stay tuned for next Monday for our continued series on the JQA Treatment. As always, stay curious and keep questioning history.